All right, Chris, we might kick off if that's okay with you. Welcome everybody. I'm Vanessa, and this is my husband John, who is the tech component of tonight's event. He's also the stand-in host should one of my children wake up and need attention. We're chatting tonight with Chris Wenban about tiny houses, and Chris is currently living in a tiny house that she owns, and she also is the co-owner of a tiny house building company called Tiny Footprint Australia. And she's generously offered to answer some questions and show us around tonight. If you have questions, we're just going to, are we going to mute everyone?
Yeah.
All right, we're just going to mute everyone for the sake of sound quality, but if you do have questions, there should be a chat function at the bottom of your screen. Is that where it is? Yep. Yeah, so if you have questions, click on that and post them and we'll answer them as we go. All right, Chris, so let's kick off. We'll answer a couple of the commonly asked questions and then we'll have a look around your place if that's okay.
Oh, yeah.
So Chris, people talk about a tiny house, but as we've seen at the village, there's tiny houses and then there's like really tiny houses. Is there, what is a tiny house and what makes it different to like a granny flat or a caravan?
So when people talk about tiny houses, they invariably talk about the thing you see on the HGTV or Living Big in a Tiny House, Bryce Langston's YouTube channel, which is a tiny house on wheels. So the biggest fundamental about tiny houses is that they are built onto a trailer. And this sort of movement started off in the US really after the global financial crisis, because people didn't have enough money. They were trying to find a cheaper way to live. And the reason that they're often built on a trailer, the fundamental is you don't need a building sort of a DA development application to build one, because it's not a house. It's effectively comes under the regulation around caravans and vehicles. So when people talk about tiny house on wheels, tiny house, they usually think about tiny house on wheels. They can be various different sizes, but the range you generally see is from the smallest you probably see is about 5 meters long, 6 meters long. Mine is 7.2 meters long, so I'm probably kind of a mid-size, pretty standard size, up to, legally, you can go up to 12 meters long from a road rules perspective, but I think the longest I've heard about is 10 meters. And then often they are the same width. And the reason that they are the same width, which is 2.5 meters wide, is because that adheres to road rules. So as a vehicle, or a trailer, they have to adhere to road rules if you don't want to have a permit when you're towing it. So you think, when you have a caravan on the road, it's adhering to the regulations, so you don't need a permit to tow your caravan. Tiny house on wheels, if it is 2.5 meters wide, you don't need an oversized, and less than 12 meters long, you don't need an oversized permit to actually tow it. However, most tiny houses, and this comes from the US, only move 2 or 3 times in their lifetime. So, and getting an oversized permit is actually not a big deal. You just needed the permit for the date. You apply for one, you pay a little bit of money. So if you wanted to have something that was slightly wider, you would need an oversized permit to move it, but then that gives you a little bit more space inside, obviously. But the only thing you then have to start thinking about as something that's on a trailer, you need to think about the weight. So you don't usually think about weight in houses, but you have to think about the weight in the tiny house. So a tiny house is on a trailer. It's sort of small, but can vary in size. And then when you build it, you have to think about how does the whole thing weigh, not just for what vehicle that might pull it, but also the engineering of the trailer to make sure it's sturdy enough to take that weight through its lifetime.
Okay. Tell me, Chris, when you brought your tiny house up to Narara Eco Village, did you actually tow it behind a car?
Mine wasn't towed for that journey. It has been towed on the road before, but because it came up from Victoria, we decided to put it on a low loader truck. which came as far as it could, which wasn't straight into the village because of power lines. It couldn't get safely through because basically it took it up to 5 meters in height. So it dropped it off in Dean Street, which is a couple of streets away. But yeah, we brought it on a low loader just because it does have a little bit of a toll on the tiny house. Mine has been built to live in permanently. It wasn't built for necessarily pulling around. So you can see I've got lovely white walls. And when these walls move with the pine lining, they're going to crack a little bit. So being on a low loader, there was less vibration. My worldly goods are all in here. You know, I just wanted to be a little bit extra careful. And also there aren't that many people who will tow tiny houses for you. We actually sort of found out through looking for someone that it was actually easier to ask for someone to put it on a low loader. So what you don't know about a low loader, it's a particularly low base of a truck. It's just like a truck with a base at the back. They put some sort of runners, as it were, at the back, and then they pull it with a winch up onto the bed of the truck, so that then it's, you know, about 900 mils off of the road as you're going along. Then you've got a professional pulling it. They deal with all insurance and all those kinds of things for the journey. So it did come into the village being pulled by a truck. For somebody in the village who was able to do that for me. They had their 6-wheeler, but it didn't make the journey up to Narara being towed.
And question, being on wheels, does it sort of rock around as you move around in it?
Not really. I mean, I have a washing machine in here. So when the washing machine goes, you'll see my glasses are like bar style where they sort of hang above each other. And I just make sure they're not right next to each other because they will ding, 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 ding. But I've got stabilizers on each corner. So mine's a triaxle trailer. So you've got the stability of that set of, 6 wheels essentially. And then I've got little stabilizers on each corner as well. So it's not a lot, but it's clearly not, as unmoving as a standard house would be. But it's not something that I ever really think about or is any issue in any way.
Sure. So it's not like when you go to sea and you've got to get used to like your sea legs. You don't need your tiny house legs.
No, not at all. I mean, you need to make sure that you have the area you're going to have your house prepared and leveled as much as possible. It's we've got a guy in the village who did a fantastic job of creating a sort of platform for me, which has got various different layers to make it as flat as possible, as stable as possible, because this is going to be, in the same place for forever and a day. So you do need to make it as flat as you can. But at the end of the day, I ended up with a spirit level and cranked one corner up and cranked another corner up until I got it as flat as I needed. You need it as flat as you can for things like, the shower. You don't want your house on an angle and then the water not to go down the plug hole in the shower.
Things to think about, hey?
Exactly.
All right, one of the biggest things that we get asked about here at the Eco Village in relation to tiny houses is like, is it legal, or the sub question of that is how do I go about actually putting my tiny house somewhere? Where can I put it? Do you have thoughts on that?
It's a huge topic, and it is probably the biggest question people ask, and it is, there are a number of factors, so it sort of depends. There's no clear answer. You've got to look at your own situation. But the fundamentals are, depending on where you live in Australia, New South Wales is the best place, as far as I'm concerned, for living in a tiny house, because it's classed as a caravan. So you need to look at the legislation around living in a caravan. So one thing that you can do, we've put together as part of the Australian Tiny House Association, we put together all of these factors and put them into the website. So if you want to look up the Australian Tiny House Association, so it's australiantinyhouseassociation.org.au. There's some information on there, and it'll lead you through to the links for your state. But for New South Wales, you are allowed to live in a caravan, which is the only classification a tiny house on wheels has at the moment. on a piece of land that already has a house on it, and where you, the person living in the tiny house owns the tiny house and is a member of the household of that, standard house. So I've lucked out by finding myself in a situation with Jazz, who is on the call, Jazz Mozzie, where she lives in a house. It's dark, you can't see it, it's just over there. She has a small house, 60 square meters, and she and I co-own the land that the small house and the tiny house are on. So I also own this tiny house. Therefore, I am a member of the household because I own the land, even though it's Jazz's house and she lives in that house. It would, I think it's a situation that would be very difficult to unpick and say that I do not come under the legislation that says that I can live in the caravan full time. But that's New South Wales. That's not the same for most other states. Most other states have a limit around the time that you can live in a caravan, either 2 days in a row or 60 days. But each individual council can also essentially have their own rules around it. So there's the state legislation, but each council might have a different view. So they have the flexibility to say, actually, we're tiny house friendly. And there are some councils around the country that are much more amenable to, recognising that tiny houses can be, a very good place to live and have the utility and all these things that you would expect from a normal house.
Okay. So basically you're saying that I don't just have to go and park in my mum's driveway, that I could find another person in a house and join their household and come to an agreement to put my house on their land.
Yeah, so when they talk about household, there is no definition of what household is. There's ownership involved. So, if your family owns a property and they have a house, then, that's a pretty well-known and obvious way of talking about household and ownership. But if you are in a situation like me, where I don't have any legal family in this country, the fact that I own the land in combination with Jazz means that we are therefore by definition a household.
Yeah, that's quite handy. A side question with that, sometimes we get asked, can I buy a tiny house and put it on my block of land before I build? Is that okay?
Not in a few situations, and again, state by state, that's different. In some states, if you have a piece of land you're going to build and you have a DA, they will allow you to live, again, in a caravan, in inverted commas, for up to 2 years whilst you're building. But that's invariably in sort of more semi-rural, rural spaces. So it's not something you could probably do in a city centre. Mm-hmm. So some states do allow it. To be honest, I'm not on top of whether New South Wales is one of those, but that would be the circumstance. If you have a block of land with no house on it, you can't just put your tiny house on there and say, right, I'm living here now.
That's crazy, hey? They make it pretty hard. All right, next question. How many people are in your household?
In my household?
Or in your house, I should clarify.
How many people live in my house?
Yeah.
Just me and the soft toys.
Is tiny house living just for like singles or couples? Who's it for? Anybody
who wants to. I know of families. I know of families with a couple of children, smaller children. I've seen stories of people with teenage children, single parent families with a teenager, couples, singles. Probably the only combination I haven't seen and stories of is a couple with a couple of probably older children. And you can probably, it just gets to the point where you physically need more space and the fridge wouldn't be big enough. But yeah, there's the demographics. So the Australian Tiny House Association did a survey last year of, it was the first one done around Australian data, of who is interested in tiny houses, who lives in tiny houses, all those kinds of things. And the biggest demographic that either want to live in a tiny house or are sort of probably currently living in tiny houses are single females. It's sort of on the higher end of the scale as well as sort of the lower end. So single females, and then younger couples as well are probably the other demographics. There are certain people who sort of tend to it more for some obvious reasons around financial situation, potentially just being able to live in a tiny house. I personally would struggle to live in a normal sized house with anybody else. So it's down to the person as to whether or not you can really live in a tiny house with whoever it is that you might want to.
I hear you on that some days. Chris, are you okay to give us a bit of a tour around your house?
Yeah, sure.
It's called the Mayflower, I understand.
Mayflower, yes. So this is my little kind of nook that I have here.
Hang on, Chris, I can't hear you very well.
Oh, sorry. I have to be right in the front. Right. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, I'll try and stay in front of the camera, the microphone. So I designed it myself. So I have my little L-shaped sofa lounge. I'm right-handed, so when I sit on my loungy area, I'm like this with my glass of wine and my cup of tea. It wouldn't work if it was the other way around. So I kind of started from, there are certain things that I designed in specifically because it's me.
Uh-huh.
But at the front door, I actually have
So
although am I going again? It's difficult. I have some blinds. So I have French doors on the front. As you can see, it's nice and dark outside. So if I want, it's a bit noisy. If I don't want everybody to see me, I can just put my blinds down. This is really important. This is a fly screen. So all my windows and doors have fly screens, and that's massively important, especially in the summer when you want to have the doors open, because yes, in normal houses it's annoying when you have a fly or a couple of flies. In a tiny house, when you have like 5 insects in here, it just drives you nuts because they have nowhere to go. They're all just flying around your head. So things like fly screens, they're not cheap often because they might have to be custom designed. And that's why if you can go for standard, if you're designing yourself, you can go for standard size windows, you're more likely to be able to get standard sized fly screens. So little things like that do make a difference.
Good.
And my Luxaflex blinds, which I love. Then next to the front door, I have my little cupboard for my jackets, and I have my shoes down there, shoes and boots. So when I designed my house, I thought about, how do I move around? What do? I come in, I take my shoes off, or when I go out, I might want to put a coat on or take my shopping bags. So, those kinds of things you want to think about. So this is my house. Valley style kitchen. I like cooking, and so that suits me. Other people might not want as much space. One of the important things is my
Hang on, Chris, come back. Where have you gone?
I've got a little flip up here. So that's my desk. So if I have my desk up and then I can sit, look out the window, and that's where I work and study and things like that. So it's a versatile use of space. I don't necessarily always have that and use that.
Great.
I have stairs. These are my stairs going up because I have a loft bedroom. That's my loft bedroom up there.
Is that your wardrobe in the tub?
No, there are clothes in there, but that's not, they're clothes I haven't touched in ages. So they're things that I'm sort of deciding on. And downsizing is a big deal with a tiny house, and you don't do it all in one go. Invariably, you end up with stuff. And once you're in here, you end up downsizing even more because you realise how much.
Chris, can I ask you a couple of questions that are coming through right now?
Cool.
Is your tiny house on the grid?
It is on the grid. It's designed so it could be off grid. I have gas, so behind me you can see that's a marine heater. So I've got gas heating, gas cooking, gas hot water. So it could be off grid if I wanted it to be. But I'm actually connected into the village electrical system, which means that all of my electricity is solar anyway here.
Okay. And question about your tiny, does it have to be like registered like a trailer?
Trailer has to be registered. So yeah, that's the only thing. There's no registration for a tiny house. It doesn't exist. So the trailer has to be registered to go on the road. And then I'm pretty sure that so insurance is always a big thing with tiny houses. I'm insured through CIL. They're one of the few people who know what the hell a tiny house is when you call up. I haven't tested it, thank goodness, but I would think that you would need to keep the registration up to be insured. So I just keep paying, even though this will probably never go on the road again. I'll keep my registration up, my trailer registration.
And is that literally like the same cost as for like my box trailer?
Yeah. So it's an annual fee that I'm actually paying to Vic Roads because it was built in Victoria. So.
Okay, fantastic. I've got a question here too. Did you build the house yourself?
My tiny house building company did, which was my co-founder. It's her family, a family of tradies, and her brother-in-law is a builder of normal houses. So he actually built it. So I designed it, but I didn't actually physically build it myself.
Oh, sure. And did it, in terms of like the building time, does it take the same amount of time as like a granny flat, or is it faster or slower?
Tiny houses, and this is some numbers that come out of the US, but have played out with what we've seen is they take about 1,000 hours to build. So that's 2 people full time for about 3 months. So that kind of gives you an indication. A lot of people think, oh, I'll do it at the weekends. And then you see stories of people almost having nervous breakdowns because they're into their 3rd year of trying to do it all at the weekend and work full time and this and that. So 1,000 hours, and that's for somebody who knows what they're doing. So that's for somebody who is a sort of tradie and is in the building trade. So if you don't have those skills already, you'll probably need to redo things as you go. Yeah. Sure. So you can add more to that.
And there's a question here too about you're currently positioned at Narara Eco Village. Are there other tiny houses here? And if there are they all attached to like a built house?
So they have to be, yeah. So that you wouldn't be able to have a tiny house in the village unless it was on a lot with a house. Sure. So there are others here, and they are all in combination with another house, and yeah. Oh. So that's.
Oh, can we go and have a look at your fridge now?
If you like.
Or your kitchen?
I need longer arms. Right, where are we?
Oh, nice.
It's actually an IKEA kitchen. It's the drawer system. Where am I? This is my sort of office end of it.
Sure.
So it's got the drawers in drawers, which is fantastic. And also I found much better than having cupboards, normal door cupboards, because you need to use every single inch of space. And it's an awful lot easier to get. I'll show you my food pantry. I went shopping today, so it's a bit full. That's my food. There we go. So I stack things up a lot. So I've got containers that I stack up, but it means I can get right to the back of the drawer. My cutlery drawer, I like this one. So that just pulls out. Spice piece. That's nice and easy to use and get right to the back. So I love the drawer systems. Yeah, so it's just an IKEA IKEA sink. There's a lot of IKEA. You can see IKEA shelves. That's how
Hang on. Chris, come back.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's how I hide my washing up, is I put the board over the top.
Excellent. And since question about the weight, how heavy is your house?
It was, when it was built, it was right on 3.5 tons, but I've put a fair bit of stuff in it, so it's more the 4.5 tons now.
And so putting like a standard kitchen in was okay weight wise?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it just depends where you're going to put in weight and save weight. There are so many different ways you can do it. Appliances are a bit difficult. They're kind of standard sizes. I've got a full oven, but again, if you were to not have a full oven, you could not have a washing machine, things like that, it would take the weight down. If you don't have, nice hardwood and recycled timber, then, and you've just got chipboard, that'll take the weight down. So there's lots of things that you can look at. Steel frame as opposed to timber frame makes a difference. But also then when you're building, it gives you less flexibility. So there's pros and cons of most things. But I had a spreadsheet where I just, when I kind of calculated everything, IKEA is great because they put weights in, because they all come in flat pack packages.
Sure.
So, you get the funny looks when you ask people how heavy is the fridge and how heavy is the cooker, but you have to weigh everything so you can get an idea.
Sure. We've just got a question here too. You said that you actually owned, you said that you actually owned the land.
Mm-hmm.
What about if you don't own the land, or if the house owner that you're kind of camping on their land, if they are renting? Is it possible to put a tiny house there if you're renting?
So again, I'm kind of giving you what the regulation says, and what therefore, what you can point out in a piece of paper. This is why councils that are more amenable to tiny houses can actually say, no, that's fine. Yes, the state regulation says you have to be, as the person who owns the caravan has to be an owner and the part of the household, but potentially if you're in an area where they're amenable to somebody bringing their own tiny house and putting it on a piece of land, the biggest crux will probably be that having a house. If there's no house there already, that really kind of stretches the rules too far. But if there's already a house there, then really what difference is there as to whether or not you're the owner of the land? So there are definitely places that there's a database that one of the people in the tiny house movement started building up, looking at the different councils and their attitudes towards tiny houses. So it really, you have to think about the location you're trying to put it, and what the people around there are going to be thinking about it in terms of the council. And then what's the piece of land, what's the actual situation, who the neighbours are, whether or not they're going to complain, because if they complain, then the council has a duty to look into that, and it's probably more likely that they'll need to be a bit more stringent.
Sure. So just being a bit cheeky, Chris, if you got on well with your neighbours and you've been renting somewhere for a little while and you had a mate who wanted to come with a tiny, assuming that your neighbours said, yeah, go ahead, mate, would there be anything wrong with just sort of planting it there and waiting to see what happened?
People have done that. People have done that. There are people living in tiny houses around the country that are not following the letter of the current regulation, which is why you have to hunt them down, because they're usually a little bit kind of, popping their head down behind the parapet.
Yes, and now's probably a good time to say too, Chris, isn't it, that all of the advice that we offer tonight is to be taken with a grain of salt. I've got a question here. Can we go and have a look in your bathroom, or is that a bit personal?
That's okay. I've closed all the required.
Lots of questions about toilets.
Oh, right. Oh, I have a Nature's Head composting toilet.
A composting one?
Yeah.
So does that mean that you collect your waste product somehow?
Yeah, so see at the front there with the little black strap, that's a bottle, that's the liquids, and then the solids are in that. So what you see there is the toilet. It's sitting on a blank floor. There's no pipes or anything going anywhere. The liquids I'm currently disposing of down. We've got an ablutions block quite close to us. You'll know that, Vanessa. So I just pour it down the toilet, and that's every 2 or 3 days.
Sure.
But I am actually setting up a system in our kind of garden where we're going to have some citrus trees, and citrus trees and trees love the nitrogen. So I'm actually going to be pouring it underground to feed our trees.
Excellent, excellent. And go on, I've got to ask, what do you do with the solids? I mean, you're a couple of doors down from me, so now I'm actually invested in the answer here.
You know that big compost bin in the corner by my stairs?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is this like kind of like a dog poo compost system?
It's just a normal compost system. So it's actually called Humanure. There's a term for it. And there's an entire book about it. So if you're at all interested, go and Google the Humanure Handbook. You can actually download a free copy from the Humanure Handbook's website on PDF. It's a very scientific book, but it's written in a really interesting, funny way. And basically you just deal with it like you deal with compost. It's just another form of compost. You need to add some carbon to it. You need to kind of give it some liquids. Once it's full, you need to, let it sit there and cook. The only thing they talk about with that is that when you finally end up with compost, and it is truly compost at the end, you don't put it on the carrots, you put it on the fruit trees.
Good one.
And that's more about people's perceptions than the only thing that can survive 2 years of cooking in a compost. And they do say, should be 1 year, but let it cook for 2. And the only thing that could survive a year would be roundworm. Roundworm should be gone in 2. I don't have roundworm, so wow. I don't know where the roundworm's coming from, but it's not going to be in my compost.
Oh, good, great. That is really reassuring. Thank you, Chris.
You can say I've answered this question before.
For those of us that are sort of feeling a bit like that's a bit too much effort, are there other solutions where I don't have to bucket out my own waste?
Yes, so there are different types of toilets. There's incinerated toilets, so there's a few things which aren't necessarily composting in that same way, but you could also just have a standard toilet and link it into either a septic tank or sewage. Where I was in Victoria, my next door neighbour who lived in a tiny house, she was an 82-year-old lady, and she just had a flushing toilet that went into the septic. So if you're in a rural property that already has a septic, that's a possibility. The only thing there really is, if you're on an urban block and you want to be changing the sewage, I can't see that really being a great possibility unless, like we have in the village, you already have someone who's built their own house and actually planned and put in a separate sewage connection, which then the tiny house is connected to. So the beauty we have in the village is, as we're planning our houses, people could put in, even if they don't think that straight away they would have a tiny house, they could plan in and put a DA in that includes a separate or another sewage and kind of point, and then that could be connected to the tiny house in the future.
Just to backtrack, an incinerator toilet, does that literally set your waste on fire?
It does.
Wow.
Not whilst you're sitting on the toilet.
Okay, and so you're left with just like some charred ash?
Yeah, basically ash.
Okay, wow.
But that's obviously more energy intensive as well. So, composting composting toilets don't use all the water that a flushing toilet does, and don't use any form of energy. So they're, from an environmental point of view, the best thing.
Yeah, and it's also quite handy to be able to move your house more easily.
Oh, yes. So the wheels and the toilet are the two things that mean that this tiny house has a huge amount of freedom. Everything else is really easy to deal with. You can deal with water, you can deal with power, but the toilet and the weight and moving it and the wheels are the two biggest factors.
Have you got a shower in there as well?
It's just it does get a little bit small when, so I hang up my mat. So
oh yeah, I love that. Oh there.
And I just have my, sorry, let's just try to work out. There we go.
So
It's like a normal shower.
So it's a normal shower head. You've got full-size shampoo. You don't have to get in there and feel like you're in the TARDIS or something.
No, it's not a 90. I think it's a 785 ml by 800, so it's very slightly smaller than a standard shower, and it's obviously not one of the big ones. I've been in showers where I kind of look at it and think that's half the size of my house. If I'm in a shower and I have to walk to change the temperature, I get really distressed now.
Chris, we've got a couple of questions about tiny houses that are not on wheels. I'm not sure.
Yep.
I'm not sure. I think you'll probably be able to answer them. Do we have any tiny houses not on wheels at the village?
We have what I would describe as small houses here. So, which would be a granny flat. I mean, Jazz's house is 60 square meters. So it's a small house, but it's my square meterage actually is, if you include the loft, is 26 square meters. Anything below probably 50 square meters is probably officially a tiny house. So we've got some granny flats here, we've got small houses, but the only ones that are really this, actually Emily's I think was
35.
Granny flat was 35 square meters, so it's a little bit bigger, but I include my loft in the square footage, so the footprint of hers is a bit bigger.
And I guess the problem with building a small house or a tiny house not on wheels is that you have to go through the regular council process. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. So you have to get a DA, you have to, obviously have the expense of that and the expense of building a standard house and buying the land, and, which is probably the most expensive bit out of it nowadays.
And again, you don't have that flexibility if you do need to move or whatever.
Yeah.
And do you know, Chris, is there any regulations about how small a house you can build, like not on wheels?
I don't know, to be honest. I don't know. Jazz might know because she was looking at all of that kind of stuff. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, Jazz, do you remember when you were looking for yours? Was there a limit to the size of your house? I've heard some councils won't actually let you build a small house.
I know one of the other ladies, Eileen, was looking into that, and as far as I know, there wasn't a limit, but I can't remember now.
Okay, and that
Emily's is 35 square meters.
Sure, and that probably is different for different council areas as well.
Yeah, but she is officially a granny flat, so there might be different rules. Yeah,
sure. I think there's a question here too about shipping containers. Can you do a shipping container as a tiny house? And I'm not sure whether they mean on wheels or without the wheels. Do you know?
Yeah, you probably wouldn't put you'd have a big trailer and then you'd put a shipping container. But there are some disadvantages to shipping containers, so I probably wouldn't. If you're going to put it on wheels, I'd just do a tiny house. I'd just build something custom. There are a number of people who've used shipping containers for some more putting multiple ones together. I mean, New Zealand's got some fantastic examples in Christchurch. There's a whole load of architects who've done some amazing things with shipping containers. The things that you need to think about are, where has your shipping container come from? So what's it been holding? So are there any?
Oh no, Chris, the aliens are in the computer. You're frozen.
Toxic issues with the
Chris, the aliens have got you.
I don't know. Holding in the past.
Tiny internet connection. Sorry, everyone.
Am I back?
Are you back?
I am. Are you?
Yes.
We're probably both on Nev Wi-Fi, so we might go at the same time.
Oops. No, sorry. Can you repeat what you were saying about the shipping containers and using a shipping container as a tiny house?
So you have to think about where a shipping container has come from and what it has been used for, because it might have been used for some form of toxic materials or something. And the other thing is insulation. It's a metal box. Do you want to be living in a metal box unless it's been treated properly with insulation as well? And it's, I mean, they make great materials, but for people who are, you know, architecturally are doing things, but they're making sure that they're dealt with properly. So a DIY, I know of people who've done sort of DIY shipping containers, but they need to think about, you know, specific things if they're doing that.
Yeah, sure. Chris, have you got like a favourite place in your tiny house?
Yeah.
And the $1 million question, how much do tiny houses cost?
It depends. It's always, you know, how much does a house cost?
Yeah.
You know, it depends. But generally, from my experience, if you're looking for something that's custom built or a good quality build, from about 60,000 to 80,000, depending on the size and things like, you know, how many appliances you've got in it, because prices generally include all appliances. And mine is a bit of a deluxe because I designed it to myself, and I got all the whistles and bells. So, you know, I imported my marine heater from Canada. Things like that. You didn't have to do that. I could have just used the electric ceramic heater I'm currently using. But mine was about 120,000 kind of retail price. But yeah, I mean, this is designed for somebody to live in it permanently full time. So it's got all of the appliances and all of the functionality a normal house would, but very tiny.
Yeah, sure. Because sometimes on like Facebook and stuff, I see companies advertising tinies for much less than that. And I do wonder a bit about the quality of the build. I've also heard of people looking to reduce the cost of their tiny house by doing it themselves. But I think you spoke a bit about, you know, about the perils and the time length.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at, I've seen numerous things, you know, from the US, build a tiny house for lady built a tiny house for $15,000, and it's like, yeah, okay, but was it all reclaimed materials that she got for free? How long did it take her to? If you're using reclaimed materials, then you need to spend more time dealing with them, because you need to make sure that all of you know, pine panels are the same size and the same width, and do not underestimate, especially in Australia, the cost of labour. Cost of labour is between 1/3 and 1/2 of the cost of the tiny house. It's a huge portion. So if you're looking at a DIY cost, does that include somebody working out how many hours they spent? And like I said, it's time and time again, we've heard people talk about, I've talked to builders in the US, I've been in France, I've seen tiny houses around the world. And when I say it takes about 1,000 hours, everybody nods and goes, yeah, that's in the ballpark of what we use.
Yeah. So Chris, looking ahead, the world's changed quite a lot since you moved in with your tiny house.
Mm-hmm.
What do you reckon are like the big trends for tiny houses in Australia?
I think, you know, potentially we'll follow the US a little bit, because they're, you know, ahead of the game a bit. I think there will be more and more councils and that will individually sort of state that they're tiny house friendly. I think there'll probably be a bit more regulation come in, because it's a bit Wild West out there at the moment. There isn't any regulation. There are a lot of really good builders who have got experience in building and therefore, you know, can build safe structures. But I expect as anything, that there will become more regulation as this becomes a sort of a bigger thing. And you know, with the pandemic and people reviewing their lifestyles, I think there will be a push for living in a slightly different way, people realizing that they don't need as much stuff, that they want, you know, remote working. If you can work remotely from a more rural area, then a tiny house on wheels is perfect, because you don't have to say, oh, well, you know exactly where you want to live for the next, you know, extended period of time. You can make a plan, have a tiny house on wheels, live in a place for a few years, and then move on, and you know, kind of work more remotely, as a lot of people obviously are doing as well, who are able to.
Yeah. I've got Freddie here with a question about Narara Eco Village. He's wondering whether the tinies that are at the village are all kind of clumped together in a bit of a configuration like that?
By coincidence, my next door neighbour has a tiny house, but that wasn't a deliberate thing. And it's funny, when I first got here and started talking about tiny houses, everybody did start saying, oh, well, you know, we could have a little area, they could all be in a line. And to be honest, I don't see why they need to be. They're not, you know, that we're not any different from anyone else. We, you know, we eat, we sleep, we kind of have a gin and tonic on Friday night. You know, why do we need to be put in a little ghetto in the corner somewhere? I mean, notwithstanding the rules around having to have a tiny house on a property that has another house anyway, but it's just it's actually a perfect way to use the land more efficiently. So rather than having a tiny house village, if everybody in an area was to be able to have the option of having a tiny house, you could have people with, you know, different income levels, potentially different sort of dynamics around their family, or, you know, how they live, whether they have a family or not, then living in the same area. And there's a great TEDx talk by Zach Giffen, actually, who came to the village a few months ago, just before lockdown, who talks about tiny houses as infill, and it just being the most perfect situation, because you can have a tiny house that, as you said, comes for a few years, but then sort of moves on and somebody else takes its place, and the person in the main house can have the advantage of maybe some income from renting out the space where the tiny house is, or the support of having someone, you know, there to help them out with certain things that they can't do themselves.
There's certainly a lot of flexibility there, isn't there? Yeah. I've got a question going back to how you actually, you say you wanted to move on from Narara Eco Village. Could you actually attach that trailer to your own car? Or do you have to have like some super pumped up truck?
It has to be a pretty pumped up truck. The two-door Honda Civic that is sitting outside this house will never ever try and attempt to, doesn't even have a hitch on it, so it would never attempt to try and pull this. No, you want a decent vehicle, and Australia, funnily enough, doesn't have that many big vehicles in the same way the US does. So I think the last time I looked, there are only about 10 or 12 that could pull like 4.5 tons. And you want a driver who's comfortable driving it as well. So unless you're sort of somebody who's pulling around heavy trailers and not just something filled with mulch or cow manure, as we know very well in the village, then you'd probably want to get a professional, you know, the 2 or 3 times, hopefully it will move in its lifetime.
Yeah, sure. And I've seen on some tiny house shows, I've seen that they've got all this extra stuff that they like build around the house once it's in situ, like decks and pergolas and stuff. Does it take you long to sort of pack your house up to move? Or do you know, is it a couple of days just dismantling your exterior?
So when I moved from Victoria, I did have some decking, but it was built in such a way that it could be towed out. It wasn't physically attached. It was just constructed next to my house. So it probably took them a couple of hours just to move that out safely. And then in terms of me preparing the house, I use masking tape I tape all the drawers so they don't open up. I did bring in everything down from the loft. I even brought the mattress down just in case. You know, took all the cutlery off the shelf, the crockery off the shelves, all that kind of stuff, packed it into boxes. I did not have it, even though it was on a flatback truck, move with everything. So, but everything was pretty much packed down into the house. So it took me a couple of days of kind of, you know, putting everything together to get it moved. So it's not like a caravan. You don't just flick a switch and then move on. But there's a couple in the US who have got their tiny house that's designed for traveling. So they do have everything. So they kind of flick a few things that are already there to keep their doors shut, and then they just move on.
Oh, sure. Okay. Chris, I remember seeing, I'll just do a plug for the Bower in Marrickville. They're actually auctioning off a tiny that they've built out of reclaimed stuff through one of their tiny house building courses. Do you know anything about that?
I haven't been on their courses. I know Guido from the Bower, and they definitely, in terms of people who've had some experience in building tiny houses, They've been around for a while and been doing workshops, etc. So, you know, it's definitely a name that I know and have a good reputation.
Because I think I saw that the bidding guide for that started at about 18,000, but it's just a shell, so you'd need to fit it out depending on whether you wanted a loft or a more accessible bedroom or whatever. We're nearly out of time here, so if there are any pressing questions that I've missed or that you particularly want an answer to, feel free to hit me up again in the comments. Whilst I'm just waiting to see if there are any more questions coming in, I might do a bit of a spruik for our Narara Eco Village online open day, which is coming up.
Nope. Vanessa, I can't hear you if you're still talking.
Maybe not. There we go. So we also have another couple of events.
I think so, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Do you think? All right. So we have the online open day coming up on May the 30th. And it's much more fun when you can actually come on site here at Narara Eco Village and have a walk around and check out the different types of houses that are being built here. But for now, we'll be online May the 30th, 10 to 11:30. And we've also got a couple of other events, Friday night chats coming up. One with Jeff, who has just finished building his own hemp house as an owner builder. So he's going to be talking with us about sustainable building design on June the 12th. And then talking with the founder of Narara Eco Village, Lyndall Paris, about some of the more interesting eco villages that she's visited. One of her favourite things to do is to, when she's travelling around Australia or around the world, is to go to all the different eco villages and take some of their gems of knowledge or wisdom to apply here at the Eco Village. And she's been to some very interesting and I would say crazy eco villages. So that's coming up too. Oh, hang on, this is good. A couple more questions here. Where can you do tiny house building courses?
There are a few people who do them. If you, again, go to the Australian Tiny House Association website, so australiantinyhouseassociation.org.au. They have a whole load of members and some of them do building courses. So one name that I know, Fred Schultz, does, before the COVID, was going around the country doing them, but I think he might have something online now. Guido and the Bower, I know that they've done those in the past. Yeah, so look at the Australian Tiny House Association, because they tend to put a calendar of events up and people are doing things like workshops.
Sure, thank you, Chris. One last question here. If you have a tiny house and you want to find a spot to put it, is there an easy way that you can actually find some land somewhere? Like, is there some sort of secret tiny house network that we should know about?
There is. Yeah, so there are some websites out there. So the Facebook sites where they look at both people who are looking for land to put their tiny house on and people who have land that will offer them. Usually people who have land, it's more rural situation and they're probably looking for some rent, but often, you know, sort of renting kind as well, help and support and, you know, around the land, all those kinds of things. So again, Australian Tiny House Association has or may have some stuff on there, but look on the Facebook pages as well. There's quite a few groups. There's groups often for each individual state, yeah, sort of put the word out there that you're looking for something, and then often people will guide you. It's a fantastic kind of community. A lot of people are very supportive, so you know, find that group of people in that location that you're looking for, and I'm sure you'll get some help.
Sure, thank you, Chris. I should point out too that although we're not doing open days in our traditional format here, you can still book in for a private tour here on site. So, you know, we are still trying to get as many people as we can to explore our beautiful site. It's just a bit of a different format at the moment, and they can be booked on our website. At the moment, we're doing them on Saturdays, but flick us an email if that doesn't work for you and you'd really like to come and visit us. And yes, yes, Todd, the recording of this will be posted up on the Eco Village website, on our Eco Village Facebook page, I've been told, so that you can rewatch this again, catch all the jokes a second time round. Chris, is there anything that you'd like to say to our listeners and viewers tonight?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, just now for me, it's just a house. Everybody kind of thinks that there's some big, great secret to it. Downsizing is a massive thing. Finding a place is a massive thing. But once you're here, it's just a house. So there's no problem for me living in this as an individual house. I kind of don't even notice it anymore. And occasionally, just occasionally, I feel it's actually quite big, and I get annoyed at having to walk all the way down to the end of my house to pick something up. So I never think I wish I had a bigger house.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you very much for your time, Chris.
That's all right.
Hopefully some of our viewers tonight will come onto site and actually have a look at your house as part of their tour. So thanks everyone.
Yeah, sure.
Check out our Facebook page and our website for more information, and we'll see you all next time.